Hey everyone, Wanderbot here, and welcome to Let's Try Orcs Must Die. Now, Orcs Must Die is a third-person action tower defense game, kind of like Dungeon Defenders and Sanctum, but it's single-player and a little bit simpler. It might be a little bit niche, but I guess it's a pretty good entry point if you're not into tower defense, because it has, a fair amount of shooting and action hack-and-slash type stuff. It's kind of a lot of fun. Orcs Must Die was made by Robot Entertainment. They're the people that made, Orcs Must Die 1 and 2, Age of Empires Online, Hero Academy, and they're working on a new game called Echo Prime, which I believe is for the iPad, which is kind of disappointing because it looks really cool. But Orcs Must Die was made for the PC as well as the Xbox 360, so if you don't have a PC, you're in luck. However, if you have a PS3 only, well, you're not so in luck. It was released in October 2011, and it got pretty decent scores across the board, and also got a sequel with a co-op function, and I will be covering that later, probably with one of my friends, and then doing a review of it. But for right now, we're just gonna touch on Orcs Must Die 1. In Orcs Must Die, it's a pretty basic tower defense. You have a set number of resources which you can spend on a set number of towers, and you get to place them on various towerable surfaces across the map. Very similar to practically any other tower defense you have ever played. There's a small amount of mazing that you can do, but there's only one maze tower, everything else can be passed over, and that one single barrier tower is extremely expensive, so you can't do crazy mazes looping in on each other, much like, say, Warcraft 3 tower defense game mode. This one is much more about just funneling as many orcs through a single passageway as possible, and not getting them to go back and forth while your towers shoot at them. Now, I say towers kind of loosely because in Orcs Must Die, they're much more, they're traps, where you step on them and they'll go off. You'll walk in front of them, they'll go off. There's only one tower that I've run across thus far that actually will turn and shoot an enemy. Otherwise, it's purely just movement detection straight in front of them, on top of them, or below them, kind of depending on what kind of trap it is. And they take a little bit to reset, so if you've got an arrow tower or an arrow trap on the wall, it will shoot, and then 5 seconds later, it'll be ready to shoot again. And so if you have two arrow towers straight across from each other, they'll both shoot simultaneously. And you really only ever need one, so it's kind of a frustrating little bit there. But honestly, you get so many towers by the end of it that you're more or less just inundating the orcs with damage. The twist is, you get to actually play in this one. I mentioned Dungeon Defenders and Sanctum. Both of those involve you running around as a character, building towers and fighting monsters during the non-build phase of things while the enemies are coming through. This one is no different. You play as kind of an egotistical War Mage character, and you have access to a fair number of weapons. Automatically, you will always have a crossbow that has a power shot that stuns enemies, a rapid fire thing, and if you just shoot slower, you can kind of snipe people, and you can even zoom in, which is kind of convenient. Otherwise, there's a spear sword thing that you can slash enemies with, a alchemical backpack that lets you throw poison vials that explode. I guess it's more acid vials. A belt that lets you use wind powers to push enemies away. A vampiric glove that lets you siphon health into mana or absorb health from enemies, but that uses mana vice versa, so I find it's not a very good weapon. And there are a couple more that I haven't gotten to yet, because every single time you complete a level, you get either a new tower or a new weapon that will presumably help you on the next level, but I find keeping to the basics generally works the best in the game. The basic spike trap from the floor, arrow trap from the wall, and using my, Trusty crossbow and the acid bombs. And everything else feels a little bit more side utility type stuff. I guess the barriers are super useful, but otherwise you spend a lot of your time just setting down kind of what you already know, and the other traps are a little bit more situational, and I find they're just not nearly as effective. So the enemies in Orcs Must Die are quite obviously orcs. They're also Kopolds and Ogres, and the way it works is in much standard tower defense fashion. They walk out of whatever spawn point, gate, whatever you want to call it, down a marked, predisposed path towards your crystal exit portal, whatever. If you've played a tower defense, you know how this goes. And it's actually kind of conveniently marked. There are little blue lines that show you where the enemies will be walking, so if you're planning on using a couple of barriers to block them from walking down a certain hallway and instead having them funnel through your carnival of death that you've set up down a different hallway or in a short little area or something like that, because you don't have enough resources to put down, a crazy amount of traps, and it's best to concentrate them all in one area instead of trying to pace them out, because the orcs will often walk on one side of the hallway or the other, and except for certain certain traps, more often than not, you'll have to have like double lanes of spike traps on the floor, and it's best to just keep everything concentrated. Not to mention that you as a player do a crazy amount of damage, especially if you're using the right weapons, and it's a lot easier to control them when you can see all of them. I've had Kopolds, which are the fast little enemies, run past me, or an ogre just walk right through because they take a lot more damage. And it's a lot easier to, keep an eye on things when you're actually there, keeping an eye on them, and presumably shooting them. Now, as you kill orcs, as you lay down towers, as you pick up a couple of things, as you take damage, you either lose or gain points. It's pretty simple, and as long as you're not playing really poorly, it's pretty easy to get, high scores or max score or whatever. But depending on your score, you get ranked a certain number of skulls. And skulls are used at between rounds to upgrade your towers. And you can only upgrade a tower once, and it usually just adds a slowing effect, or makes it so it resets faster, so it can shoot more often, or simple little things like that, but it still does affect gameplay in kind of a neat little way. And a lot of the upgrades are expensive, so you have to get 15 skulls. And usually you get about 5 skulls, so it takes about 3 missions to upgrade a full tower, kind of depending on the tower. I think the barrier one is has the most expensive upgrades as far as the skull cost goes, whereas the basic spike trap from the floor takes maybe only 6. So you can upgrade that fairly quickly, and that's the one with the slowing effect, which is super useful because the slowing towers I didn't find particularly compelling. Whereas the spike traps, they do damage and they slow. Convenient. Also, they're the cheapest tower, so you pretty much lay them all over the place. Now, the one last element of gameplay that I really haven't touched upon is the slots. You can only bring a certain number of towers into into a round. I think you start with 4, and you get 1 more with every level you complete or something like that, because I definitely noticed I had more slots as I got more towers. But you have to be a little bit selective, so you can't bring all of the weapons because you're going to need towers. But if you don't have enough weapons, your character you're playing as is a little bit less powerful. So I find I usually just run around with the crossbow I mentioned and the alchemical backpack. And all the other ones were just a little bit too situational for me, and then I just load up my slots with towers. This more or less just promotes picking and choosing, kind of scouting out the map before you pick, because you can switch towers as you before you go on to the first round of a map, so you can kind of scout around, look at things, see where the orcs are going to go, pick what you're going to need. So if there's a area with lava in it, you can get the wind belt that lets you push enemies off, or the spring tower that lets you knock enemies out. And there are a couple other towers that do similar effects, but like I said earlier, when it comes down to it, I just use the basics. Call me vanilla, but it's just simpler that way, and I find it's a lot more effective than trying to map out and expect the spring towers or wind belt to work properly. Plus, for some of them, you actually have to be up and close and personal, and you actually get docked points for taking damage in the game, from what I can tell. So, for example, I almost never use the melee weapon, because I take damage and lose points, and I don't particularly like either of those things. I prefer using the crossbow, which you can actually headshot with, which is a instant kill on Kopolds and Orcs, which is very convenient. Not so much so on Ogres, but you know what, they're kind of the mini-boss of every level, round, whatever you want to call it, and, it makes sense. So, apart from gameplay, this game actually has a pretty nice graphical style. I like the semi-cartoony element to it. The orcs, for example, look like orcs, you know what they are, but they're not like the Lord of the Rings, dirty, grubby-looking orcs. These are the Warcraft 2, Warcraft 3, grubby, green, fat, kind of ugly-looking, cartoony orcs. And I really like how they've been modeled, because it's fairly low polygonal. If you look at them, they're not going to be super high definition, but they're also nice and hand-painted, so they've got a much more charming quality to them than a lot of other games I see. And one thing I've noticed is games that use kind of the hand-painted look tend to stay a lot more, visually appealing longer, so that's why games from the N64 still kind of hold up, because the polygonal, cartoony quality to it still fits and looks nice, whereas trying to go back to certain, PS1 games, they look grubby and pixelated and bad because they were trying for realism at the time. So for this game, even though it was made, only 3 years ago, it will probably still look nice 7 years from now because it's going for the whole cartoony aspect to it. And that style lasts longer. And it's not just the orcs, it's, the environments, the traps, the character himself. Actually, I didn't even mention this, but the intro cutscene, there's only one, really story cutscene that I've run into thus far, and I bet there's, maybe 1 or 2 more, but they're kind of nice hand-painted, not even motion comics, but just a still that shows a story followed by, separate still showing a slightly different scene. But there aren't that many of them, but it conveyed the story pretty well. Now, on the sound effects and music, side of things, the voice acting is actually pretty good. You generally can't hear it over the, like, sound effects of the traps and the weapon shooting, but the orcs actually have individual little vocal clips, and generally I don't know what they're saying, but every once in a while I catch a glimpse of, like, no, don't hurt us, and it sounds just kind of an entertaining little thing, and I kind of wish I could hear it more, because on, I guess, sound effect wise, the traps and the shooting and all of that stuff is very loud and is very repetitive. The sound effects are very, very appropriate, but you'll be hearing a lot of arrow noises, a lot of, like, clicks and crashes and stuff like that. And it's neat, and it definitely gives a visceral feeling to the game where, you know, normally it's pretty cartoony, you actually feel like the traps are doing something. The problem is, it drowns out the pretty good music, it drowns out the good voice acting, so if you're going to be playing this game, I recommend turning down the sound effects a fair amount, just so you can actually hear everything else in the game, because they're repetitive, and they get kind of annoying. Now, the music is actually pretty good. At first I thought it was going to be kind of bad. The main menu soundtrack is kind of boring. It's very, like, not even orchestral, it's got a lot of, like, organ and piano and, like, that kind of stuff. It feels almost like, I guess, the Warcraft 2, Warcraft 3 intro music. Warcraft 2 mostly. And actually the rest of the soundtrack follows kind of that same general feeling. The game overall visually and, you know, auditorily sounds very similar and looks very similar to, I guess, what Warcraft 2 looked like, and to a degree Warcraft 3, though that was trying to go slightly more realistic and slightly more like World of Warcrafty, even though that is in itself cartoony. But so the music, especially when you get into the levels, it's got, you know, a very nice gothic tune to it. It's got a lot of organ music, it's got a lot of, you know, your general orchestral stuff. You don't have a whole lot of techno business in here. No retro, not a whole lot of guitar actually, from what I've noticed. It feels very appropriate for the game, and like I said, I thought it was going to be bad, but it turns out that it was pretty good. I just found myself losing it over the sound of all the sound effects, which is kind of a shame. Now, admittedly, this isn't the kind of soundtrack I'm going to listen to on my own iPod or anything like that, but like I said, it's very appropriate for the game, and, you know, I like it. It's pretty good, and it's not nearly as annoying or repetitive as the sound effects were. I think it actually even has individual songs per level, or at least I flipped around a couple of different levels and it did sound like the soundtrack had a different song per level. I could be wrong here, but it's enough variety that it didn't feel very repetitive. And that's pretty much it for Orcs Must Die. It's a pretty good game, especially if you like tower defenses, if you like hack and slashes, if you like, you know, kind of the dungeon defenders or sanctum style gameplay. This is probably going to be a lot of fun for you. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a multiplayer component. They added that to the second game, but not in the first one. So you'll probably be, well, you will be playing by yourself, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if you're looking for a robust co-op experience to play with a friend, I'd recommend, you know, holding off and playing the second game instead, because this one is going to be a good solo experience, but if you only like playing with friends, then skip to the second one. Now, as far as the game's length goes, I'm actually only a third of the way done with the game, and each level lasts somewhere around, you know, 10 to 20 minutes, kind of depending on how long it takes you to lay down traps and so on and so forth, but it's usually about 10 waves, and so since I'm about a third of the way done with the game, I think the game ends up being somewhere around 3 to 4 hours long, which, not that bad all things considered, but it can be a bit long just because the gameplay is kind of repetitive, lay down traps, shoot orcs over and over and over again, but if you play like a level here or there, it's great. Just don't expect it to be the kind of game you want to binge. So, I guess to sum up what I was saying earlier, if you like Sanctum, Dungeon Defenders, Tower Defenses, or hack and slash games, this game will probably be a lot of fun, and I'd wager it goes pretty cheap. It was in the Humble Jumbo bundle. I think it might have been in some other bundles too, but most of you who buy Humble bundles should already have this, and if you don't, and this is the kind of game you're interested in, I'd recommend it. It's worth it for the price. It's got, you know, good gameplay, good towers, good music, sound effects were but hey. And, you know, from a cost per minute standpoint, it's pretty good. So, I recommend it. And with that, I guess those are my overall impressions of Orcs Must Die. And I guess, as always, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys on the next review, or Let's Play if you watch those.